first of which, why do women receive harsh punishment? The second of which, what the conditions really look like for women on death row. And third, what role does rape culture and power dynamics play in all of this? As I said, I will be covering specifically looking at women on death row and then the subsequent points and addressing how that relates. My name is Brit Schulte. I'm a member of the Campaign to End the Death Penalty, Denton, Texas chapter. I'm also in the International Socialist Organization, proud FMLA member for 4.5 years. So first off, getting into this first point, why do women receive harsh punishment in this society? I want to set this up with a few statistics from the CEDP and their research and gathering. There were 61 women on death row as of January 1st, 2010. This constitutes 1.9% of the total death row population. 12 women have been executed since 1976. The most unusual, fairly recent development is the rebirth of federal death penalties for women. No women have received federal death sentences in the entire current era, beginning 1973, until one such sentence was imposed in late 2005, and then another in early 2008. Women are typically convicted to death row because of violent crimes against people that they are close to. Experts suggest that this is because of emotional or psychological concerns, which are best dealt with outside of the prison system. The mothers who were convicted were more likely to be young, single, and economically impoverished. The choice to dispose of an infant, in this case, seems related to the probable hardships the women and their babies would face in the future, making this act of murder an act of frustration over their inability to transcend their circumstances. In Texas, and in the majority of southern states, however, women on death row are there for what we in this room would call self-defense. They are there primarily because they killed an abusive spouse or partner. Typically, there is a history of violence recorded, and this gets turned against women who do then react and defend themselves with violent means. The courts typically twist this and cite the previous violence as a cause for the woman to flee, but we know this tactic all too well, and we understand that economic dependence and mental manipulation play hefty roles in why women choose to stay with their abusers. I think that it's also important to note that there can be a debate, and there can be a debate about this later, but it's important to see that the violence of the oppressed versus the violence of the oppressor is inherently different, and the courts do not recognize this. Now, the other percentage of women convicted and sentenced to harsh punishment or the death penalty have either killed or allegedly killed their children. This is in regards to some of these statistics I just read. And this is something that typically results in these women's cases being even further marginalized, because for some reason these children's lives become more valuable to a society that lost them than the woman who was ignored by the society initially. It's as if people shut off their brains when thinking about, or rather not thinking about, cases like these. Now, recall for a moment those national statistics. Most of the women that commit or are accused of committing these crimes are impoverished, under or completely uneducated, and come from poor and disenfranchised communities. First off, women in society are not valued, and I don't think there's much dispute here. I'm sure that y'all have covered in your meetings a myriad of different issues that have actually highlighted this. Women are essentially viewed as a vehicle with which to bring a new worker into society. Women are seen as disposable in this culture. With abstinence-only education, nowhere do they tell you what to do when you have a child. With no money and likely no transportation, some women end up killing their children out of ignorance or desperation. The criminal justice system now decides to care about the children's lives once they are dead. There was no safety net provided in the way of health care, welfare, or community building for these children while they were living, or for their mothers. Their deaths become tools of the state to further oppress the poor and essentially minority communities. Now, getting into what the conditions are really like for women on death row. And I want to kind of preface this with some things that I have heard, and I'm going to call them very non-serious activists, talk about in terms of women on death row. Oh, they get TV. Oh, they get the radio. They get more newspapers than men get. They really don't want help with their cases. I've heard people say these things. Now, I haven't heard people in the CDP say these things. But I have heard them in the greater abolitionist community, in more mainstream organizations. And there is this kind of misconception about what actually goes on state by state for women who are on death row. And I think that in this point I'm going to try to clear a few things up. And I do go into some graphic details, but I think that that's important too, because I don't think that we should, censor or make any bones about what's actually going on in these prisons. Okay? I'm unfortunately forced to recall a story that Ms. Geraldine Smith told me at CEDP's annual convention in Chicago last November. Now, she was an innocent woman on Illinois' death row, and the first woman exonerated from there as well. While spending years behind bars, she suffered through humiliating body cavity searches that were primarily designed for male inmates. This meant that she would have to squat and actually spread her vagina, even while menstruating, and was given nothing with which to clean herself up with after these procedures. This is also a trend with policy on female death rows. Policy is not determined specifically for women based on needs or special considerations. It's the same policy used for men, which doesn't allow for adequate pre- or postnatal care, postpartum depression treatment, or access to hormone therapies. In most states, women are not provided with feminine hygiene products. They must purchase these at commissary at incredibly high prices, or rely on prisoner advocacy programs for donations. They cannot take their birth control, or have a lot of the medicines that are deemed non-life-saving filled. Obtaining corrective lenses for women is difficult across the board, and preventative screenings like Phil brought up, mammograms, getting a pap smear, those screenings are almost unheard of. In cases of birth in prison and primarily on death row, not only are these women prisoners' decisions about care restricted, but also many incarcerated pregnant women are physically restricted while giving birth during labor and delivery. They're shackled. Phil went into this a little bit, but I have some anecdotal evidence and I have some stories about some particular women, and I think it actually sets up and actually will facilitate a better understanding of what this looks like. Okay? We need to consider the case of Shauna Nelson. When Nelson was 6 months pregnant, she was incarcerated in Arkansas. She went into labor during her sentence, and a correctional officer shackled her legs to opposite sides of a bed that transported her to a delivery room, removing them briefly only during a nurse's examination. Nelson was reshackled immediately after giving birth to her 9-pound son. She suffered both mental anguish and injury to her back, intense pain because she couldn't move or adjust her position during the birthing process. And as Dana Sussman, a legal fellow at the Center for Reproductive Rights, said, Nelson later had surgery to treat symptoms resulting from the delivery of her son. Now, she sued the Arkansas Department of Correction, charging that her treatment violated the 8th Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment. After winning her case at district court, Nelson's charges were eventually dismissed on appeal by a judicial panel that said prison officials couldn't have known that shackling was unconstitutional. Nelson was granted a rehearing before the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, supported by the American Civil Liberties Union National Prison Project. Her case was argued in September of 2008, and a decision is still pending. Perhaps most surprising about Nelson's case is that it is not at all uncommon. Last month, a former Washington inmate sued the state for shackling her during a birthing process and a high-risk pregnancy. Treatment that included a leg iron and a metal chain across her stomach that weighed 12 pounds. Also, last month, former inmates of Cook County Jail filed a federal lawsuit in Illinois challenging the facility's shackling practice. Illinois became the first state to have legislation that prohibited shackling, and it remains one of 4 states that makes shackling explicitly illegal. How many states do we have? That's not rhetorical. We have 50 states. Only 4 of these states make it explicitly illegal to shackle women during a birthing process. Then, adding insult to literal injury, the women are not allowed to be with their children, should they desire to be, after the birth. Those children are taken immediately from them and placed in court custody and in state custody until a court review. Now, I'll let that sink in for a second. One must also consider the rate of rape and forced sexual acts that are perpetuated by a power hierarchy in the prison system, especially in isolation and especially in solitary confinement for women on death row. Even in instances where pregnancy